All right, take it away, Carol and Troy.
Great. Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today and for coming to this session. So we're just going to quickly introduce ourselves and tell you, how this came about. So the session is called Using Critical Self-Reflection to Catalyze Inclusive Pedagogy. And my name is Carol Hernandez. I'm one of the senior instructional designers at the Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching at Stony Brook University. And I'll just say, well, maybe I'll let Troy introduce himself, and then I'll give a little context of how this all came about.
So I'm Troy Priest. I'm also one of the senior instructional designers at the Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching at Stony Brook. So I work with Carol quite a lot.
And thank you, Troy. So I'll just give you a little context. So in our Teaching and Learning Center, we started a once-a-month discussion where we bring in different articles and talk about inclusive pedagogy. And that's sort of like how this all came about. Like we're trying to make this very intentional and make it a part of everything that we do, because we recognize how important it is to good teaching. Actually, Troy brought in an article, and it was very interesting, and so we kept talking about it. And when this opportunity came up, we decided to propose this. So in addition to that, I'm working on my dissertation now, and it looks specifically at the work of educational developers, but within the context of organizational studies and social identities. So all three things working at once, and and what that's like. So I just wanted to let you know how this came up. Let's go to the objectives. And actually, Troy, do you want to jump in and say anything for context?
No, I just want to say that one of the things Carol's also done is we've had some panel speakers and bringing in the community, the university community together to talk about some of these issues as well. So it's been kind of within this center, but then Carol's also taken the lead on having a broader discussion with the Stony Brook community. So she may be modest and not wanting to say that, but she's been doing that as well.
Thanks.
Yep. Okay,
so thank you. So we're going to just look at the objectives really quickly. So by the end of this session, participants should be able to discuss how critical self-reflection is a first step toward inclusive and anti-racist pedagogy. They should be able to reflect on social identities and how they shape our teaching practice. And we're going to ask you to sketch out a plan that uses critical self-reflection for faculty, staff, or administrators who want to intentionally engage and support learners with diverse identities, abilities, and/or perspectives.
So we're just going to have you reflect on a few questions, and what we'd like for you to do is, there's 3 questions, and we're going to put each question up one at a time. And if you can, just go to the chat and respond to the question, and we'll kind of read them out. Carol will help me read them out. So the first question is, what does critical self-reflection mean to you? So just a quick few words. It doesn't have to be too long.
Okay, Jared says, my identity shapes my experience. Good. Intentionally being aware and questioning my assumptions. Great. Honest metacognition. Very good. It means taking the time to think about who you are as a person and how that influences my teaching practices and other choices in life. Awesome. Intersectional experiences as sites of privilege and loss. Very good. Examining my beliefs and perspectives. Good. It means being aware of what I take for granted about myself and the world. Wow. Trying to understand other people's experience of me. Wow, that's good. Denise says, looking at yourself with squinted eyes and critically assess my thoughts. Very good. Wow, you guys you're ready. So we have another question for you.
So how do you incorporate this critical self-reflection into your teaching practice, if you do? And again, just type into the chat if you don't mind.
Okay, Stephanie says, I have students map their positionalities. Excellent. Jessamine says, paying attention to what is actually happening in my interactions with students, not what I wish or hope or fear is happening. Great. Vikram says, correlating experiences to learning outcomes. Good. Ray says, I have been trying to examine my white privilege and acknowledge that when I am discussing issues related to people who have been marginalized. Good. Chris, I check my assumptions, asking for regular feedback from my students. Really good. Lisa, I practice self-reflection with my students, especially those in applied learning sections. Ask them and myself to reflect on how they are experiencing the materials, project, their successes and failures. Lucy says, when my students write about intersectionality, I also write with them. Natalia says, making sure they know I see them, really see them, not what they look like or where they come from, and that they feel comfortable speaking their truth. Ellen says, I use growth mindset, which gives me and our students a way to identify with ourselves. Wow, these are all great answers. So you're already active. Trying to engage with my students to listen and observe. Okay, very good. So I like what Sylvia said too. She said being teachable. So you're seeing yourselves as learners as well, and that's really important. Good. Okay, so we have one last question for you.
So what are the results of this incorporation of critical self-reflection? How has it worked out for you?
Yeah, what do your students tell you about this specific kind of teaching that you're doing? Okay, Jalea, I have had a few white male students over the years express feeling marginalized. Okay, Denise, they always say that I am tough but fair and they trust I want the best for them. Good. Stephanie, there are learning opportunities to decenter oneself and our cultural ways of knowing as a standard or a benchmark. Ray, my students have told me they feel comfortable speaking up about their experiences in my class. Great, great. I'm just wondering too, if you want to write in the chat box, when you do this with your students, are you explicit about what you're doing and why? Are you explicit with the students about what you're doing and why when you're doing these inclusive practices? That's a good point. Jessamine says, often we are paying attention to things that go wrong. And so we might not be aware of things that are going right unless we ask. And Stephanie says, scaffolded explicitness, if that makes sense. Ray says, I'm explicit about it. Jalea says, the course is explicit about examining the self so we can learn how to teach students from diverse backgrounds. Okay. And let's see, Chris says, in my graduate classes, okay, that they might not get it. Okay. Lucy says, I'm explicit because of the course I'm teaching and the content. Okay. Allison says, being a librarian, students might not have time to reflect. Okay. Ellen gives them lots of opportunities to make intentional connections. Okay, great. Sylvia, each group is unique. Okay, so you see it as an iterative process and apologize for mistakes. Great. Okay, good. So you see yourself and the students working together. Okay, great. That's good, Jessamine, that you can express hard opinions without everyone losing their minds. That's what we're hoping for. Okay. All right. So we're going to go to the next slide. And okay, so Troy is doing the next slide.
So, this is kind of a full disclosure slide here. So as we move through the presentation, we will be doing some sort of critical self-reflection within this workshop. And so we just want to let you know that, we're going to ask to challenge one's assumptions and to enter dialogues with each other that might be uncomfortable. So, but we hope it can be transformational and get us thinking about inclusive pedagogies in ways that we hadn't before, and thinking about ourselves within that process. So anyway, just wanting to let you know, we will be doing some think, pair, share. So, we don't want to make anyone feel uncomfortable, but we just wanted to give full disclosure that that's where we're going in this presentation. So, so one of the things that we wanted to bring a lot of ideas together in this presentation. So we wanted to bring the idea of, how can we bring critical reflection as a methodology to become more inclusive in our pedagogy, and particularly in the work that we do as faculty developers. And then this is all within the context of living in times of COVID, which certainly brings certain challenges to certain student populations, but it also could bring some opportunities, because we're certainly, at least in our institution, we find that we're actually engaging with faculty a lot more because of the pandemic. And so with that new engagement, we're hoping that we can also bring in conversations around these kinds of topics that will extend beyond the COVID crisis, and kind of something that we can continue to talk about beyond that. So, so one of the things that obviously I just want to talk a little bit about things I think we already know, but the COVID crisis and the COVID pandemic has certainly affected certain kinds of students in ways that, particularly students of color, students of ethnic minorities, or students in ways that are much worse than other students. And the CDC reports that a combination of social factors intersect to put racial and ethnic minorities in an increased risk of getting sick. And some of those factors are, of course, just discrimination, often barriers to healthcare or utilization of healthcare. Many of our students coming to us are working in occupations that could be service work that requires a higher risk of exposure, and also jobs that don't allow them, or their family members aren't allowed to work from home. So having a higher impact on their home economics. It also affects, it increases the income and wealth gaps for these students, and particular kinds of students. There's also housing and food insecurities that exist, transportation, and of course, lack of access to some technology. So we're seeing that low-income students are more likely to drop out or to not enroll at all. And that's certainly, a recent report showed that students in the past summer enrollments fell, particularly in community colleges and among Black students. So we're seeing that, you know, there is an impact with our students due to the COVID crisis and some of the issues that they're dealing with. So this is, so we just wanted to define what we mean by critical self-reflection. And so this is Jack Mesereau from 1998 saying that it is the examination of our assumptions, our beliefs, and our emotions and meanings that we have learned from our environment. And actually, I think there's probably much better definitions in some of the chats earlier, but this is one that that will bring us together. Carol?
Okay, so thank you. I'll jump in. So I'm going to go back a little bit to the context of our conversation and go back to organizational studies, which is where I'm focused for my research. And from organizational studies, there are some ideas that I think we could apply to this kind of thinking, right? So in the chat, a lot of you said it's thinking about our thinking, it's metacognition, it's, you know, challenging our assumptions. You're all right. So I just want to throw in a couple more ideas, right, that we can sort of all get on the same page before we start doing the activities. And one of them is double loop learning. So this comes from Chris Argyris, and it's a way to think about learning as a system and thinking about single loop learning, which is sort of where you find a problem and you fix the problem or address the problem, and that's the end of the story. And what he's asking us to do is called double loop learning. It's where you look at the problem, but then you try to figure out what's causing the problem. And so it asks you to take another step. The other idea that I wanted to discuss is positionality. So in the research that I'm doing, it's qualitative, and positionality is one way that qualitative researchers address their own bias. So we recognize the researcher as the instrument of research, and we recognize that, you know, we're coming to the research with our own lived experience and our own values and our own ideas of what's important, like what needs to be researched. And so positionality is one way that we sort of make it explicit and make it obvious. And that a lot of times requires us to sort of disclose, you know, our identities. So that was an idea I just wanted to put out there as we continue talking. On the next slide, we're going to look at inclusive pedagogy, and this definition came from Sanger. So she says an approach that aims to make learning as accessible and welcoming to all students as possible. And there's a little bit more to that. So, sorry, I'm looking at my notes. So she's saying that some authors talk about inclusive pedagogy as primarily in the context of racial, gender, cultural, and socioeconomic diversity. So that is one aspect of it, right? Others use it in the context of differently abled or special needs learners. So that's, again, that's part of it. But the agreement is it comes back to emphasizing equitable access in course materials and the importance of professors being transparent about their expectations. So a lot of the stuff that you've already mentioned in the chat, which is being explicit, you know, telling students not just about yourself, but why you're doing the things you're doing. So those are all good inclusive practices. The next slide is on anti-racist pedagogy. So anti-racist pedagogy is a specific kind of teaching that challenges and counteracts the structures and impact of racism using praxis as its focus. So the emphasis there is on acknowledging that we're in a racialized reality, that it exists, and that through our intentional action, we can transform it, right? So it's like acknowledging that these things exist, but then there's a hopeful aspect to it, like we're going to do something to try to disrupt it. Alejandro Steele et al., they did research, and what they said is that they said anti-racist pedagogy is not so much what is being taught, but how it's being taught. To reveal oppression, educators are called upon to reflect on racism at the individual level as well as at the structural level. Anti-racist pedagogy also requires that educators go beyond learning theory and take an additional step of action to incorporate their awareness into their teaching practice. And again, there, in my mind, we're getting back to not just that the one-to-one interaction or even the one-to-the-group interaction, but also, you know, at the organizational level, like what are we doing to uncover these maybe tacit understandings and make them explicit, so then we can actually change them. And then the next slide is on critical race theory. So critical race theory has its origins in the work of critical legal scholars, specifically Derek Bell, Patricia Williams, Richard Delgado, and Kimberly Crenshaw. And you might have heard of Kimberly Crenshaw. She's also the person that is, she's credited with the coining intersectionality, which, you know, it did exist before, it just wasn't called that. But basically, critical race theory is a way to challenge legal reasoning by looking at policies, practices, and laws within a historical and contemporary cultural context in order to deconstruct their racialized meanings. And also, CRT has been used by social scientists to interrogate the systems that reproduce inequity and that amplify dominant ideologies. So CRT, again, it focuses on disrupting power structures through social justice action. And when you look at the literature, often, you know, the first step is self-reflection, right? So that's what we're focused on today. And then the next slide is on whiteness. So when we acknowledge that we live in a racialized world, we identify, even though we know biologically there's no basis for these distinctions, we know that this is created as a social, you know, organizing idea. We still need to identify, well, what is whiteness, right? And so there are ways to define it. So here's one from Charbonneau. It's a social construction and a lived reality, a subjective experience, and a set of objective power structures and relationships that organize and influence institutions and individuals. And also, if you haven't read Peggy McIntosh, the Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, that gives you a very concrete idea of some of the privileges that maybe you might experience with whiteness, that it just gives you a moment to think about it and, you know, reflect. So so the literature does show that faculty who acknowledge their whiteness, what they're doing is they're challenging the hegemony. They're challenging that racial structure. And it kind of creates a space for then students to, not that they have to disclose or have to discuss, but acknowledging for students, like, this exists, right? This is in contrast to faculty who remain silent or say, well, I'm colorblind, I don't see color, and, you know, that's not my content, like, it's not my thing. And basically when you choose to do that, so choosing to do that is actually a privilege. And when you choose to do that, perhaps unintentionally you're also erasing or ignoring the experiences of people who are racialized and do have to live in racialized bodies and get to experience it every day. So I just wanted to share that with you. And then the next slide is on self-reflection for teaching and learning. So this one is basically just to, again, bring it to the context of higher education and pull in that idea of positionality and just to think about maybe some things we could do, right? So in one article, again, Alejandro Steele et al., they created a faculty learning community and, used that to bring together about 10 different faculty members from different departments, and they did a semester-long learning community, and they focused on anti-racist pedagogy and intersectionality and social identities. So for a semester, they kind of did this as a group, and then they then went to their respective departments and courses and used that information to transform what they were doing. And then slide 14, we have inclusive teaching in action. So here we have Brookfield, and that's an article that Troy brought in, and Kishimoto. They both assert that faculty must reflect on their social position as a first step toward practicing inclusive and anti-racist pedagogy. And they argue that that inclusive teaching challenges us to talk about race and inequity and to bring it into our course content, bring it into our classrooms, and be open about it so that we can take action in our campuses and even in our surrounding communities. So it really asks you to take a stand and then do something. So now we're going to Troy.
Thank you. I was talking and didn't have myself unmuted. How often does that happen? Sorry. Yeah, so the question then becomes like, how do we bring these ideas and these practices into what we do as faculty developers and in our faculty development programming? And again, Brookfield talks about how sometimes the underlying assumption about inclusiveness and inclusive pedagogy is that it can be reduced down to a checklist or just a set of outcomes that can just kind of be achieved. That something can be done or kind of be cracked and kind of be understood, and then we can kind of fix it. And I think Carol and I, we assert that we can't just address these with a series of workshops, and that that kind of misses the point. I mean, there could be maybe some things that could be done as a series of workshops, but that the real the real change and the real transformation is going to come through having an ongoing discussion and an ongoing processes that are humbling, and that can be uncomfortable, but that can also be very transformational. So it's something that it's kind of a lifelong learning opportunity rather than just a kind of checklist of things that need to be done. Having said that, what are some ways that we can actually begin to have conversations in small ways or move towards a more inclusive approach? And some of the things we could do are things like, just having a reading group might be one way to do it, bringing in different different articles to read that will help us reflect on our practices. Having a community of practice is one way to do it. Carol has, as I said earlier, begun to do some kind of town hall meetings or discussions where we bring faculty and different community members from around the different parts of the university and having those conversations. But it could be something as simple as just, asking your students how to pronounce their name and getting a sense of a little bit about who they are and just knowing how to pronounce their name. particularly if it's an unusual, non-standard name. So, Carol, I want to pass it back over to you.
Okay. So we're going to do an activity now, and we have come up with some guiding questions. And what we're going to do is, so Troy and I are going to answer the first two questions, and we're just going to model, but it sounds like you guys already know how to do this, but we're going to model nonetheless. And then we're going to put you into breakout rooms, and we have a couple of questions for you to answer in your groups and come back and share. So first, we'll just start out with the questions that we're going to answer. Okay, so what are some of my own social identities? So are they explicit in my practice? So for myself, you know, I consider myself, identify, right, as a Hispanic woman. I'm, you know, cisgender, heterosexual, mom, wife, you know, graduate student, and first generation college graduate, daughter of immigrants. Like, I'm just thinking of all the different identities, and are they explicit in my practice? So one of the things that I do with my own students, because of the work that we're doing in class, so it's related, I'm asking them to do assignments where they're doing some of this work, so it naturally aligns with me talking about my identities. But what I would say is, you know, it's very personal, and it's sort of like, it's context specific. So in some contexts, maybe I wouldn't want to talk about this stuff, and also it's embodied. So some of it is just like what I'm living, and some of it is how others see me. So me personally, like, I've, depending on where I am, like if I'm in Texas, people might think I'm Mexican American, or if I'm in Miami, they might think I'm Cuban American, but I've also been mistaken for like Chinese and Filipina and Indian. And so it's context specific. It's depending on where I am at that moment and who I'm interacting with. And sometimes I will bring it up, and sometimes I won't bring it up. It really depends. So that's my story. So I'm going to let Troy go.
Thanks. So, so obviously, some of my social identities is I'm a white male, I'm heterosexual, married, Southern, so that might have some social identity. I'm from Kentucky originally. And my social identities in the United States and working here, I spent most of my adult life working and living overseas, and I lived in South Korea and worked there, and also in the United Arab Emirates for about almost 20 years. So my social identities were quite probably brought to the surface more because I was a foreigner, I was an American, I was a male, and I was teaching at a predominantly female institution. So those, you know, being an expat in someone else's country certainly brings out those kinds of identities and brings them to the forefront in ways that they didn't necessarily when I was just working and teaching many, many years ago here in the States. So, so they were very explicit in my practice, particularly, you know, working in a foreign country where I'm an American, and my Americanness was a very much an important part of how my students saw me. But now teaching in here at Stony Brook, yeah, like Carol said, it's very much contextualized, so it's very different. And I'm still kind of grappling with it because I've only been back to the States after most of my life being overseas for about a year or so. I still see myself somewhat as a, you know, I understand my identity within the context of the United States, but I also feel like I'm an outsider looking in sometimes. Okay, so that's all I have to say about that.
Do we have I think we have another question.
Okay.
That we're doing.
Oh, sure, yes.
Okay, so this one is, do my social identities matter in the context of my teaching? If so, how? So for me it does. When I am in a classroom and I'm with students who maybe share some of my identities, it's important to me that they know who I am. Specifically for students of color and Hispanic students, because there are not enough of us in higher ed that are teaching or doing research or publishing. Hispanic women are the least likely to earn a college degree or to be in any profession, right? So to me, it matters. And so I do make it explicit, and also because it's part of my research. So I do. I talk about it, and they tell my students say it matters to them. So that's why I do it. So Troy, how about you?
Yeah, it's I'll be frank and honest. It's a little uncomfortable for me to talk about this, and Carol and I have had these conversations for preparing for this, and even and outside the context of this. I think my social identities. I mean, I'm aware of there's a certain privilege that I have in the context of my teaching, and that those embodied social identities that Carol was talking about earlier, are there's certain assumptions that are made about that. Like, I'm a white male, I'm, pushing middle age. So I look like kind of the stereotype of what people expect in some of those, in a teaching position in many ways, in kind of in a traditional sense. So it, I probably don't, I don't bring up my social identities as much as I haven't in the past. And I feel like it's something I need to work on, and it's something I need to do more of, because as I've had these conversations with Carol and others and exploring this topic, as Carol said earlier, just making it explicit and not just assuming that because I'm, I look like what they may expect me to look like in terms of a professor, that being able to talk about this, being able to bring it out into the open, allows them to be able to bring out their own identities as well. So it's something I'm working on, and I think it does matter in my teaching, and I think it's something I need to become more aware of in my teaching as well.
Good. Troy, we have a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is from Natalia. If you were teaching abroad, how do you think student experience of you has changed now that you are in New York?
The student experience of students here in New York,
Right.
because
So
of my experience. Mm-hmm.
Right. Now that you're here, teaching here, like, do your students see you differently because you were teaching abroad?
It's the course I have taught was it was actually called International Higher Education with our Higher Education Administration course. So because my experiences overseas for many years was related to my expertise to be able to teach the course, and my understanding of that topic, I think it gave me a certain amount of certain credibility for the course that I was teaching. I do share that information with my students that I taught abroad, and I do think, and I hope it does show that that there's a certain openness to that my experiences allow a certain openness to different ideas, different identities because of my experiences. So I don't know how they feel for sure, but I would like to think that it provides them an opportunity to have more conversations about their own experiences, because I have, because of mine. I don't know if I answered your question, but
Yeah, I think that's good. I mean, it makes sense because within the context of what you're teaching, it does lend you credibility because
right.
You're teaching international education and you've done international education. So
Right.
that's good. Okay, so right now we are going to put you in breakout rooms, and we're going to give you a question, and we're going to ask you to just share with your breakout room partners. And this session ends at 12:30. So I was thinking maybe we would just put you into a breakout room for 5 minutes and then come back. Okay, so 5 minutes in breakout rooms.
So Carol, I'm just going to recommend that we make, I know you said 3, but I'm going to recommend 4 just because sometimes people in these sessions turn it on and then they go off and do something else and they might not always be active when you put them in a breakout. So
Yes,
I
okay.
don't want anybody in a breakout room kind of just by themselves.
Okay,
Well,
thank you.
I'll make 4. All right, so I'm going to open them all up, and in 5 minutes, I'll give you a 1-minute warning in 4 minutes. And is the prompts the questions that you have here?
No, we have another prompt.
Okay, so we're gonna have to give them. Okay, yeah.
Should I put that in the chat?
Yeah, if you could put that in the chat, then everyone will be able to see that when they go into the breakout room. I'm pretty sure. So.
Okay, I'm gonna do it right now.
Because we will both go into a breakout room too.
So we'll go into a breakout room with two of the participants, right?
At least, yeah.
Or Troy and I will go into different ones.
Yeah, yep.
Oh, okay, all right.
Okay, so. All right, so Jilly is saying actually the main room chat disappears when you go into breakout. So actually, if you put it in the chat now, I will copy it, and then I can actually broadcast the question out to everybody in the room. So if you just put it in the chat there now, I'll copy it and I'll broadcast it to everybody. Okay. All right. So we're gonna say 5 minutes though, right? Okay. All right, so I'm putting everybody in the breakout rooms right now.
Hello.
Hey, Troy. Do you want to join a breakout?
Looks like you did.
Resuming the recording.
Okay, so how were your conversations? Does anybody want to share in the chat box what came up in your responses to the question? So let's see. The question was what assumptions and biases around identity, race, and equity. So I had a conversation with Allison, and we talked about library collections and decolonizing the library collections. And she was saying that by default, you know, history and different disciplines, they're sort of predominantly white male authors, and you know how decolonizing them means sort of looking at them critically and thinking about, you know, who needs to be pulled in, right? What needs to be weeded out. Anybody else? Okay, Jessamine says, we talked about how the emergency pivot has made us much more cognizant and aware of economic issues and access to technology, educational equity issues. Yes, definitely. Right, not all students have a desk and an office, and actually I don't either. I'm in my kitchen. So yeah, there's a lot of assumptions about how students are going to be able to do online work because they might not have access to computers or Wi-Fi or, you know, even time or space. Michelle says our group focused on digital inequity. Okay, good. All right, so why don't we look at the next question, and then we're going to go into breakout rooms again.
Did the chat show up when you were in the breakout? Like, did you see that in there?
Yeah, I saw the question. I think you put the question up for us.
Okay, yeah. So if you could put it again in the chat, I'll do that again.
Oh, okay, I'll do that.
The main chat also shows up on the side.
Okay, thanks, Maureen. Well, I'll just do it both ways so we make sure.
Okay, so I put the question in the chat box.
All right, so. Okay, so I will do it again, 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you.
Do you want to be in
Yes,
the same rooms? Okay, I'm going to open up some of the, I could
yeah,
have everyone in the
good.
same rooms. Okay, I'll just open up the rooms again. All right, everybody should be back.
Yes, thank you so much. So we have one more question, and then we were going to then turn to what are the next steps. And I know that we're sort of running out of time, but first, let me just ask, can anybody share what they discussed in this breakout session that we just had?
We actually ended up going not so much our own class, but on a program scale, how that on a program scale, adapting to the objective or understanding what the objectives are for the whole student body, which benefits everybody. I'm sorry, I forgot the name already, but from Broome was talking about how they run their comp courses. And I thought it was really interesting. If she could jump in, that would be awesome.
Sure, sure. At SUNY Broome, we this has been years ago before I was even the comp coordinator. We don't let our comp teachers teach literature. There are literature classes on campus. If students are interested in literature, they can take a literature class. But we've really made our comp courses focus on what our students need and what they will need, whether they're going forward in college or whether or not they're graduating in 2 years and going into the workforce. And so we are very conscious about what we have them read and how we approach writing.
Excellent, thank you. So we are kind of running out of time, and what I'd like to do is do one more breakout room, and we're just going to give you the last two questions. So it's a question for discussion, but then the last part is, what are your next steps, right? What action do you want to take? Like what's going to change as a result of you coming to this session today and having these discussions? Like, what are you going to do next? So those are the questions. And if we could go into breakout rooms and switch up the people so you get to meet somebody new, and then we'll come back. 5 minutes.
No music, please.
Okay, everyone's back.
Great, thank you so much. So we're really running out of time now. We have 5 minutes left. Does anybody want to share what their next steps are going to be? Like, what are you going to do now when you go back to your home institutions and you're thinking about programming or teaching? What are you planning to do? If you could put it into the chat box. What about for programming? Any programs you want to create, like, I don't know, reading group, panel discussions, town halls, workshops?
Yeah, there's some things in the chat there, Carol. I don't know if you see those.
Okay, okay, I see one from Ronnie. And he was in one of my groups. He uses cartoons with his students with conversation bubbles, and he has them switch their point of view and their perspectives, and that sounds like a great activity. Advocate for more of these ideas with faculty from Ian. Jalea, I'm going to protect myself from students and faculty who refuse to confront their own biases. Natalia, be better at creating spaces for the students to relate to one another. My big remote teaching challenge. Ian, we have an Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. They host town halls and book clubs. Denise, the book we spoke about, Administration of Lunacy, Racism, and the Haunting of American Psychiatry. Interesting. Jessamine, they talked about breaking down the silos on campus, particularly between Teaching Center and Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Ria, ask my students what their understandings or experiences of art are. Okay. Loy has a social identity slide that he puts up in Zoom 15 minutes before starting as an identifier for students. That's good. And then Lucy, someone in my group said this and I'm going to do it. Don't rush the curriculum, give more time to reflect. That's a good point, yeah. Communicating to students why we're choosing to use inclusive pedagogy strategies, right. Thanks everyone for facilitating this difficult discussion. Okay, thank you, Ian. All right, so thank you so much. So I just wanted to leave you with some more ideas. I'm sorry, some more ideas. On the last slide, I have just some theories and models, and some of them are from learning theory, some of them are from organizational studies. They might interest you, check them out. We are going to share our slides with you all, and I've also posted a link to all of our references in the chat box, but we can also share those with you in the slides. And I want to say thank you so much to my co-facilitator, Troy. Thank you. And thank you, Chris, for making all this possible. And thank you, participants, for spending time with us today.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Troy.
Thank you.
So yeah, we actually have a minute or two if anybody had any last questions, but if not, what we're going to transition to now is first I'm going to